Thank you, Patricia, for the invitation and for the introduction, and of course for organizing this. I think it's a really amazing and exciting event. So as Patricia already mentioned, my main field of interest is neuroscience. I am working at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra at the lab of the Center of Brain and Cognition. And in particularly, what the main question in neuroscience, as you can imagine, is try to understand the brain. So this is a very broad question, but we are trying to follow the scientific way of trying to answer that question and to be so concrete and specific as possible. So in particular, in my case, I am leading one of the labs there, which is the lab of theoretical and computational neuroscience. So meaning that our approach and our methodology for trying to understand what the brain is doing is more theoretical. So what we are trying is to understand the underlying phenomenology of a specific brain function and trying to discover in which way or which mechanisms underline those specific brain functions. So at the end of the day, what we are trying to answer is in which way the brain encode, process, and compute very specific and different type of information. So let me, perhaps just to be more specific, try to give you an example so that you get a kind of more pedestrian type of feeling or flavor of what we are speaking about. So for example, one of a very typical type of function, which is very interesting because it's absolutely essential for our survival, and we are applying as human or as animals, really practically in every second of our life, is the decision making. So we are trying to understand in which way the brain, our brain, are making different decisions. I mean, it sounds like trivial, but you can imagine that it's a question that's even before the neuroscience time and before the Galilean style of making science was trying to answer by different type of philosophers. For example, just very trivial and without going into the deep, I mean, in which way we do a decision. It's just in a random way, so I just take a stochastic random decision, or we are trying, for example, to make a decision by using our rationality, by being optimal in some sense. So we don't know the answer. And we are trying to understand in which way we compute that particular decision and how this is computed in our particular hardware, so how we compute this in the brain with neurons, synapses, with biophysics and chemistry. So for example, we are trying to study very, very specific type of decision making, very simple type of decision making, what we call nowadays perceptual decisions. Perceptual decision is, as I said, we apply this every second. For example, I try to decide in which way I will walk. So it's clear that I will try to walk in the direction of a door and trying to avoid different obstacles. So actually, it's are very simple type of decisions. So, and nowadays we have the possibility to describe the phenomenology of the brain associated with these different, or made during the process of making that decision. For example, if I try to decide or to discriminate between two faces, then I can observe the behavior of that particular person during the discrimination. For example, I can evaluate the reaction times, I can evaluate how good they are. Is the reaction times always the same, even in the case of a simple decision, of an irrelevant decision, or it's different when the decision is much harder or it's much more relevant? How good I am. I am always equally good? Well, I think as humans we are very much aware that we are not always equally good because we do a lot of errors. But we are trying to answer that, I mean, of course, from a scientific point of view, not only macroscopically, as I just said, at the behavioral level, but nowadays we have a lot of new technologies which are allowing us to look really at the brain during the making of that decision. So when I compute a very particular and specific decision, I can, for example, observe the activity of the brain in the human or in different animals with a neuroscanner. And I can, for example, observe in which level of activity are observing the different parts of the brain. So is all the brain activated, or is only locally very specific parts of the brain activated, and in which way are activated? And that helps us a lot to try to understand the computation of the decision. A third way, just to cover all the levels, so we already have seen the macroscopic, the more mesoscopic biophysical level, and we can even go to the microscopic level, usually in animals, from time to time also in humans, where we can insert electrodes and monitor basically the way in which specific neurons, so really at the cellular level, behaves during the making of a decision. But the key question, and here is where we come, is that we can accumulate a lot of phenomenology related or correlated very strongly with that specific function, in our case, decision making. But the key question is really now to make sense of that phenomenology and to come up with the mechanism. So what is hidden behind this phenomenology? I mean, this is absolutely usual in science. I mean, it's the way how the physics or chemistry was so successful. In biology, there is a certain tradition which is more attached to the pure phenomenology, but that's, I think there was a radical change end of the 20th century, and of course, during the first decades of the 21st century, where we discovered that we cannot make sense intuitively from all this phenomenology, and we are obliged really to come up with models, with theoretical models, which explain us in which way this phenomenology is related or is revealing some very specific mechanism. And that is what we are trying to answer. Another very, very simple example, just to give you a totally orthogonal type of example is, and which is very popular and it's a kind of hot topic nowadays in neuroscience, is observing now not the brain when it's solving a very specific function or observing a very specific microcircuit, but observing the brain, for example, when it's doing nothing, what we call the resting state, the spontaneous state. And we can observe the whole brain during that process and try to understand the global mechanism in which the brain is working. And just the last word, of course, the interest is not only academic, but if we try to understand how the healthy brain, the human healthy brain works, we can have a chance of better understand what is breaking down in disease and trying to do something at the clinical level, so as an application. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. Yeah, it's really very interesting what you do, but I think it's more interesting, at least for me, to see what had been your path, because you started as a physicist.
Were the results of a series of many decision-making. And yes, I study originally, so my background is actually in atomic physics, so in Argentina. I have done my first PhD in a field which is called quantum electrodynamics, which handles the way how the sub-world, so the atomic level behaves
and so how was this path? How did you get to the neuroscience?
Well, that is interesting. Actually, physics, and in particular atomic physics, of course, as you can imagine, is absolutely an exciting field, and I love it. I mean, I still love that, I have to confess. But at some point, I realized it, especially when I was teaching and when I was doing my research, that actually the type of research that we do nowadays in this particular field, in atomic physics, is very complicated, very complex, but somehow boring, in the sense that all really the exciting discoveries were done during the first decades of the 20th century, when people discovered the subworld of atomic subparticles, so the discovery of quantum physics. And therefore, I always had a kind of nostalgia, I mean, and say, well, that is really exciting because the methodology is fancy, but actually it's not so relevant what we are doing. And after 2 years postdoc that I started to do in France and in Germany, I decided that I wanted really to go for a more challenging field. And in neuroscience, it's exactly the opposite.
So it's a new ground.
I mean, actually, there is a lot of phenomenology, but there is basically no theory. So now in my lectures, I proudly say to my students, they said, now we are in the
creating the
20s
field
of the quantum physics, because now we are creating everything.
We are almost in the 20s of the 21st century.
Exactly, that is the case.
So that's great. And also I was amazed when we were talking about how before, I mean, not long ago, I remember 10, 20 years ago, we studied the brain, these maps of the brain, just showing kind of geographically zones to do certain activities. Yeah. But now it's just more about the networks that are below that. So yeah. How is that?
Well, that's actually very interesting from a philosophical and historical mainly point of view. I mean, of course, we are always biased by the type of technology that we are using, and because basically the most plastic and biophysical type of methodology that we were using was single cells recordings, which are extremely local and very specific to brain function. Then we were biased to think that really the brain is solving all the problems with 1 neuron, or with 10 neurons, or with 100 neurons. Then in the 80s, 90s came all the years of the technology of neuroimaging, where we again can see now the whole global activity of the brain, but still people were biased in trying to think and to look really for very specific local regions in the brain, trying to be correlated with whatever task you are interested on. And now, actually, and I think it's really very, very recently, and I think it's related with really with the theoretical knowledge that we were able to gain during the last years, we discovered that that makes no sense, and that in reality it seems to be the case that the brain is really working so efficiently and doing so many complex functions because it's working extremely in parallel and in a network. So all these different brain areas which are activated, of course, as we measure with all these technologies, in reality are working together. And therefore integration or network is nowadays the key word.
You see that I'm thinking now that it's kind of a paradox that now that we are in the time of networking because of internet, is that we are probably able to see that the brain, I'm kind of projecting what is our own society. We can see now that the brain is about connections,
absolutely.
About pathways.
And there is a field in science now which is called actually complex system or network systems, and the same type of technologies and mathematical framework that we use for describing, as you mentioned, internet, for example, is exactly the same type of technology that we use for trying to understand the brain. For example, just a little aspect. I mean, you know that the topology of the internet is very particular. It's what we call nowadays a small world. Mm-hmm. So meaning that the path between different species across the world is relatively short. It's like in sociological relationships. So actually it happens to me. When you sit in a plane going from Paris to Frankfurt and you sit, of course, near some other person and you start to speak with him, I mean, making relationship, I mean, there is a path of probably 5 peoples. Mm-hmm. And then you discover that you have something in common with that person. Well, in the brain it's exactly the same, and that is, of course, extremely efficient because 1 neuron in the posterior part with 1 neuron in the anterior part, which are really far away from each other, if we have also a small world type of topology, then they can connect very efficiently and very rapidly.
But this adds a level of complexity to the study of the brain and also to the possibilities, for example, for finding or trying to understand certain pathologies or even normality, because exactly. If it's in such complex connections and unpredictable, probably too.
Well, this is actually the challenge, and we are trying to go in that direction. And basically, as I mentioned at the end of my really brief speech, was that in a clinical context, I mean, perhaps the way how we integrate information. So if the network is working properly or not, could be a very good biomarker for different type of disease.
What interesting. But now I have to read the questions from people who are connected. So there's somebody saying, how decisions vary from culture to culture? What is this? A hard question.
Yeah, that is very difficult to answer. Of course, I mean, as I said, I mean, in order to be able to answer this type of question, one has first to answer the most simple type of question. So how we make a very simple decision, how we discriminate between two phases. Actually, this is even in the discrimination of two phases, there is a cultural component. Because if I have to distinguish two Caucasian phases, and we are Caucasian, for me it's very easy. But as you know, when we go to Japan or Chinese, we have the impression that they are all equal. Of course, not for the Japanese. They can distinguish very well.
Because we don't have the cultural
markers. And for them, we are all equals because we have all these big nose. I mean, so meaning that there is a strong cultural component on that. But how exactly that interact, even at this very basic perceptual level, is very difficult to answer at this point. I mean, but we will come to that.
And when you were also talking about how in specific pathologies you can, now you were also mentioning in certain types of depression or Parkinson, you can now identify in the specific place to act on it.
Actually, the tendency nowadays is really not to identify a particular place, but to identify a particular failure at the network level. So what is going wrong in major depression, in schizophrenia? Parkinson is more focal. So there are many diseases which are very focal by definition. For example, epilepsy or a stroke. I mean, they are focal by definition because the damage is focal. But the effect could be really at the network level. So the challenge nowadays is really to identify which kind of biomarkers, which are mainly aiming to describe that network level, are more informative for first detecting this type of disease and perhaps teaching us something about how we can deal with that and probably going into therapeutic treatment.
I mean, it gives big hopes, but at the same time it's kind of scary because it's such a complexity. How to discover all these,
that's not
these connections.
I mean, that's fantastic.
Oh, that's great. That's why you are doing what you are doing. How is working in Catalonia for you?
It's a pleasure. I mean, actually, I think I told you before this meeting, I was working in Germany and I have a very good position there. But at some point, my family, my wife is also from Argentina, and as you can imagine, there are some cultural differences, not in the making of decisions, but in the normal life when you live in the north. And we decided at some point really to go to a more normal country. So
that's cultural too.
So and at that point, really by casualty, I was contacted by ICREA, so the Institut Catalán de Recerca y Estudis Avançats, and which is actually a very singular thing in Catalonia, I have to say, and it's not typical at all in Spain, because they were interested really in catching people
the
just because
people.
of the CV and not because of the nationality, friendship, or familiarity, or whatever. And so they have done a very good offer, and I have to confess that really at that point my decision was a very difficult decision. Was really more family oriented. So say, well, okay, I have fun until now in this life. I do something for my family. I have to now to say that was an excellent decision, also from a professional point of view. I came here 12 years ago, and I really further developed scientifically, exponentially, and I met really a country that I was absolutely not aware of, and it's fantastic. So I am a happy no Catalan.
That's great. And how many groups of research you have within your center?
In the Center for Brain and Cognition, we are nowadays 8 groups. Actually, most of them are ICREAs. So with different orientation. I mean, actually, all the other groups are more at the experimental level. engaged with different technologies, and we are in total like 120 people.
Wow.
So most of them postdocs, so most of them senior researchers, and most of them from abroad. I would say, I mean, I don't know now by heart the statistics, but I would say over 90% are people which are not from Spain, of course not from Catalonia. So it's really a natural, really focus of abstraction. Thing which is not difficult. I mean, I think we are doing reasonably science, but to try to convince a person to come to a lab doing pretty well in a nice country is relatively easy. So.
To come to Barcelona, that's already
that's helped the making of the decision.
But thank you very, very much for presenting your work, for talking about your interesting
pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
And we will be in touch, and at the end we will see each other again.
Thank
you, Dr. Deco.
I mean, in which way we do a decision is just in a random way. So I just take an stochastic random decision, or we are trying, for example, to make a decision by using our rationality, by being optimal in some sense. So we don't know the answer. And we are trying to understand in which way we compute that particular decision and how this is computed in our particular hardware, so how we compute this in the brain with neurons, synapses, with biophysics and chemistry. So for example, we are trying to study very, very specific type of decision making, very simple type of decision making, what we call nowadays perceptual decisions. Perceptual decision is, as I said, we apply this every second, for example. So let me, perhaps just to be more specific, try to give you an example so that you get a kind of more pedestrian type of feeling or flavor of what we are speaking about. So for example, one of a very typical type of function, which is very interesting because it's absolutely essential for our survival, and we are applying as human or as animals, really practically in every second of our life, is the decision making. So we are trying to understand in which way the brain, our brain, are making different decisions. I mean, it sounds like trivial, but you can imagine that it's a question that's even before the neuroscience time and before the Galilean style of making science was trying to answer by different type of philosophers. For example, just very trivial and without going into the, I try to decide in which way I will walk. So it's clear that I will try to walk in the direction of a door and trying to avoid different obstacles. So actually, it's are very simple type of decisions. So, and nowadays we have the possibility to describe the phenomenology of the brain associated with these different, or made during the process of making that decision. For example, if I try to decide or to discriminate between two faces, then I can observe the behavior of that particular person during the discrimination. For example, I can evaluate the reaction times, I can evaluate how good they are. A very broad question, but we are trying to follow the scientific way of trying to answer that question and to be so concrete and specific as possible. So in particular, in my case, I am leading one of the labs there, which is the lab of theoretical and computational neuroscience, so meaning that our approach and our methodology for trying to understand what the brain is doing is more theoretical. So what we are trying is to understand the underlying phenomenology of a specific brain function and trying to discover in which way or which mechanisms underline those specific brain functions. So at the end of the day, what we are trying to answer is in which way the brain encode, process, and compute very specific and different type of information. Thank you, Patricia, for the invitation and for the introduction, and of course for organizing this. I think it's a really amazing and exciting event. So as Patricia already mentioned, my main field of interest is neuroscience. I am working at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra at the lab of the Center of Brain and Cognition. And in particularly, what the main question in neuroscience, as you can imagine, is try to understand the brain. So this is a